So, this is my second reading wrap up for March. It's been a bit of a slower reading month for me this month. I don't know why. In fact, March generally does tend to be a little bit on the slower side. I don't know why that is. It's just a thing that happens to me. But here are the next 5 books that I read. I am cheating very, very slightly because the last book I'm going to talk about I actually have about 80 pages of left. But I feel like I'm close enough to the end that I might as well just film this now while I'm doing a bulk filming session rather than finish the 80 pages and then come back and tell you my thoughts, which will inevitably be exactly the same as what they are right now. So first up we had the channel's book club book for the month, which was The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson. It's about a princess called Leah who is getting ready for her wedding day in the opening chapter of this book, and it's an arranged marriage and she's not too keen on the idea because she wants to marry for love. So rather than going ahead and getting married as planned, she decides to run away, and she is pursued by her would-be husband as well as an assassin. And there's a bit of a love triangle that goes on. The middle section of the book is a little bit slow and mundane and doesn't work for everybody. A lot of the people who read the book for book club found the middle section a little bit dry and slow and boring. It didn't bother me so much. I don't know what that says about me finding mundane, everyday stuff interesting to read about. There you go. But I did, and the second half, sort of the final third of the book, really picks up and is much more fast-paced and intriguing. What I would say is don't read this book on audio because it's a full cast audiobook, which means that even though the main mystery of the story is you're not supposed to know which male character is the prince and which one is the assassin, if you listen to the audiobook you will know very, very early on which one is which because full cast. You can tell their voices are completely different. So that was a little bit annoying, but I still enjoyed it in spite of that. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend reading on audio because you don't get the same impact, I don't think. I mean, I can't say for sure because that's how I experienced this book the first time round, but there you go. That's unfortunate, but I still enjoyed it is the point, and I am going to be picking up book 2 in April. Then I read book 2 in the Queen's Thief series, The Queen of Italia by Megan Wallen Turner. I also listened to this one on audio and followed along whilst reading. I really like reading that way. I just find it incredibly immersive, so I try to do that whenever I can. If I can get the book either through Scribed or through my library, then I will tend to read that way if I can, and especially with this series because it's narrated by Steve West, who is my favourite narrator, and I really, really enjoy this series. It's a fantasy series. It's kind of fantasy light. There's not like super complicated magic systems, super complicated world building. There's a little bit of politics, a little bit of war, but it's a really much more character focused story, and so we skirt over a lot of those political details. So if you're looking for an in-depth epic fantasy, that's not what this is. This is the feel of epic fantasy in terms of scope, but with the sort of just entry-level, low-level fantasy level of writing and in-depthness, which is not a word, but we'll ignore that. So I really like this because I do read a lot of complex fantasy, and so it's really nice to have a fantasy series that is just focused on characters and doesn't spend a lot of time on world building and doesn't spend a lot of time on a complex magic system or complex political maneuverings. The focus of the plot is more focused on politics than on anything else really, but it's still very light in that area. The first book, which is just called The Thief, follows a character, Jen, who is in prison at the beginning of the story, which you may know by now is one of my favourite tropes because he's offered an opportunity. He can be released from prison if he agrees to do a little errand, shall we say, for the king, which he does, and we follow that story in book 1, and then this book really expands the world a lot more and expands on the characters and gives us a lot more character depth, and I really enjoy the characters in this series, and I enjoy the simple, straightforward writing style where we don't spend pages and pages and pages and pages dealing with complex political manoeuvrings, like I said. So I really enjoy that, but I think you need to know what you're getting into. Don't go into this expecting super complex plot lines. That's really not what this series is about. If you're a character-driven reader, I think you'll really love it. But if you're a plot-driven reader, it might leave a little bit to be desired for you. Next up, I read Save the Date by Morgan Matson, which is a contemporary story. I thought that it was contemporary romance, and there is a romance plotline, but it's much more just based on the contemporary, I would say, so don't go into it expecting a romance because I don't think it really is that. We follow Charlie, whose big sister is getting married, and so the family are gathering together to celebrate her sister's wedding, but everything is going disastrously wrong. It's quite the comedy of errors. Everything you could possibly think would go wrong does go wrong. That does lead it to be somewhat predictable because you already know going into this that everything that seems to be resolved is probably not going to have been resolved. It's probably going to deteriorate into anarchy because that's the whole point of this book. But I did really enjoy the family dynamics in this one. I picked it up because I was needing something light and fluffy and easy to read, and I don't think this quite did that for me because there was just so much drama going on that I just felt quite stressed on behalf of the characters whilst I was reading this, because it was just one thing after another constantly going wrong. And although there were some sweet elements and there were some enjoyable parts, it wasn't quite what I was expecting at the time. It's still an enjoyable book. It just wasn't quite what I was hoping it would be. It's a little bit predictable, like I said. It's a little bit more overly dramatic than I perhaps thought, and there's not as much of a focus on a romance storyline as I perhaps was expecting. So bear all of those things in mind, and I think you would still really enjoy this one. I did like it, I just didn't love it as much as I expected to, sadly. Then I finally read Ash Princess by Laura Sebastian, and I really enjoyed it. I expected to enjoy it because Elle from the channel Elliot Brooks really likes this series, and I have very similar reading tastes to her, so I expected to like this one, but I did really enjoy it. I didn't read it as quickly as I wanted to just because things are a little crazy right now, but I did really enjoy it. We are following Theodosia, who in the opening chapter of this book watches her mother murdered in front of her very eyes at the age of 6. Yeah, 6. And her mother is murdered by the people who are overthrowing the kingdom, or queendom actually. And so we then jump forward 10 years where Theo has been living in this horrible situation. She's essentially kind of a figurehead for the old monarchy of this land, but she's used as an example to the people that this new monarchy is in charge and they are nothing and no one and they're unimportant, and this new monarchy can do whatever it wants to Estrella. And Theo is a really interesting character, and there's a lot goes on in this book that I don't really want to tell you about because I don't want to spoil anything, but Theo is a really great character. There's a lot of really great characters in this, and it is quite tropey, but it is easy to follow, and because it's so tropey it's almost comforting in a way because you kind of know what to expect. There's nothing too surprising in here, but it is really well written and easy to follow and really easy to engage with the characters. Even though it's tropey, I am really interested to see where the rest of the series is going to go, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and I do recommend it, even to people who read fantasy all the time. I think it's just a really enjoyable, easy read, and if you don't read a lot of fantasy, it probably is a pretty good entry-level one, because it's not quite epic fantasy, but it's more typical fantasy than the Queen of Italia or the Queen's Thief series, because although the Queen's Thief series is easy to follow, I don't know that it necessarily prepares you particularly well for what to expect in fantasy, because it is that more pared back, simplified version. And so if you then go from this to reading, say, something like this, it's quite actually, even though this is more epic fantasy in scale, this is more epic fantasy in like plot content. So I think you'd struggle if you had it in your mind that this is what fantasy was like, and then you went into something like this or something in the adult genre. So I do actually think this is a really great entry-level fantasy story, because it's so tropey. But if you're new to fantasy, that's not going to bother you, and if you're a seasoned fantasy reader, then this will probably just be a nice, comforting, easy to read fantasy story with some really great characters and some interesting plot lines. And then finally, my sheet entry that I actually have 80 pages left of, we have Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson, which is the last book that is currently out in the Second Era Mistborn series. And I've had some trouble with Second Era, if I'm being honest. Alloy of Law, I felt pretty on the fence about. I wasn't a huge fan of it, and Shadows of Self was the same. I wasn't hugely keen on it. It was fine. Very, very Western style mystery plotline that I wasn't really too keen on. But this, even though it is still sort of not quite as Western style, admittedly, but it's still there, and it is still a mystery plotline. I don't know why, but I'm enjoying this one much, much more. I feel like it's because there's a lot more character depth being explored in this one, and there's more emphasis on the relationships between the characters. There's not quite as much emphasis on the mystery plotline, and I think that very subtle shift is what makes it better for me, because I'm just not a plot-driven reader. I need to be behind the characters, and I'm feeling much more behind the characters in this instalment than I have in previous instalments. I've read it very, very quickly. I started it yesterday and I'm on page 358 with only 80 pages left to go, and Shadows of Self took me about a week to read, even though it was a shorter book. So I'm definitely enjoying this one more. I am listening to it whilst reading it again, because I like reading books that way. It's immersive, but also I really like Michael Kramer, who is the narrator for this series, so that helps too. But I did listen and read to at least the second half of Shadows of Self, and I still struggled with that one. So I think that this one has really made a big shift for me in this series, and I'm really pleased, because I was really worried, but I'm actually really enjoying the series now. So just in time for there not to be any more books for me to read for this series for a while. But anyway, those are the next 5 books I read in the month of March. I hope I'll be able to finish maybe one more before the month ends, but that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks. Bye.